among you all in the middle of this. It's good to see all of you this morning. Bert has told me that the choir has a 20 after 10 call today.
Depends on who's teaching.
You may recall last month, I was concerned that he was going to leave at 2 minutes to the choir practice. So, you know, I'm glad you're here thus far. And I know that the congregation looks forward to always to the music, and we appreciate see if any other choir members in here. You're the only one today. Appreciate the work of our choir. They rehearsed yesterday for what, 3 hours in the middle of the day for their program tonight, and that is at 7 o'clock tonight in the sanctuary. So be aware of that opportunity as well. Well, you all have been looking at the lives of two women who were part of the world's oldest profession, and also who managed to make it into the story of the scriptures. And this morning, it won't be near so provocative because this morning, what'd you say, Ransom?
Think of some of the background of the material that you have Billy going to pass over.
This morning, we're going to look at one more woman who plays a prominent role in the story of the Hebrew people. The Bible is a remarkable book. It's really an anthology of 66 books, 39 in what we call the Old Testament, the Hebrew Bible, 27 in the New Testament. And out of all of those 66 books, only 2 bear the name of a female. You all want to tell me what those 2 are? Ruth and Esther. Good. Ruth and Esther. You get, all of you get an A for today in class. I think it would be fair to say that if you divided up the work of the Bible, the Old Testament, into parts, you have the law, the Torah, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. You have the prophets, major prophets, and then 12 minor prophets. Minor not because they're unimportant, but because they are smaller in the scope of their prophecies recorded in the Hebrew Bible. And then the remainder is generally called the writings, and the writings include a variety of things like Psalms, Proverbs, etc. But most of the writings consist of prose or narrative portions of the Old Testament. And understanding narrative in the Old Testament is really a function of 2 things. The first of those is understanding and the historic particularity of the story that is of which the narrative consists. That is to say, Bible stories happen in a particular time, in a particular place, and to particular individuals. Like all stories, Bible stories contain a setting, an author, characters, scenes or events or actions, dialogue in and among the characters. So this collection of historical facts or particulars is the then and the there of Scripture. This happened then, or this happened there. And the process of examining this historical particularity is a process that Bible scholars call exegesis. When you exegete a text, you're trying to find out all of the particulars about the historic situation and understand what that is. Now, the book of Ruth, the historical particularity of the book of Ruth is really that it's a love story. And it is a love story, charming in many ways for its brevity. It's about a woman, actually two women, who make a decision that has far-reaching implications for their family and ultimately for human history. It's not a preachy or a moralistic book. It doesn't give you a code of conduct. It doesn't have things that you must do or must not do, commandments. It is simply a story. And the date in which the events happen, the name of the author, we don't really know. But the setting is largely among the Hebrew people during a time in which they were close-knit tribes living in the land of Canaan. So the first element of a narrative is the historical particularity. The second element that we are trying to look at in a narrative is its eternal relevance. That is to say, we're trying to answer the question, what does this story mean here and now? What does it have any contemporary and therefore eternal relevance to us? And the process of looking and trying to understand the relevance of a biblical text for our own lives today is something that scholars call hermeneutics. It's an attempt to interpret the story. Well, the book of Ruth not only has historic particularity, it also has eternal relevance. And I think the theological or the relevant point of the book of Ruth has to do with the providence of God, the care and the concern of God. Because Ruth is a story that shows how the hand of God is continually at work in the inconspicuous lives of a migrant family. The family undergoes a series of misfortunes, sorrows, and somehow God manages to overrule all of those in God's mysterious, inscrutable way. So God's grace is not limited by natural boundaries, by ethnic distinctions. God's work is in the lives of all people, people who are particularly ordinary. So even when we cannot see the work of God, even when we cannot know it in its immediacy, nonetheless, God is at work in human lives. And our role then is to be faithful to God as God continues to work. So that's what I really described for you is what we preachers try to do when we preach on Sunday mornings. We try to take a text, a biblical text. We try to understand its historic particularity, the nature of the story, its setting, its characters, its events. And then we attempt to contemporize it in some form or fashion to find out what its eternal relevance is for the lives of the people in that particular time and place. And so I think that gives you an idea of what at least most of us who climb into the pulpit once in a while are trying to do when we make that effort. And it's also what we do as teachers on Sunday mornings to try to understand the exegetical task and the hermeneutical task. So that you don't have to pay extra for that today. That is just a little bit of background about what we try to do in order to take that, to look at those two things today, I want us to look at the book of Ruth in its wholeness. And I want us to look at it through 6 separate scenes that take place in the book. If I was to outline the book of Ruth, I would say, it is a series of vignettes, and each one helps advance the story to its conclusion. The first scene is a scene that takes place in the land of Moab. And let me begin, that's really the first 18 verses of chapter 1. In the days when the judges ruled, I'll stop here to say, when the judges ruled, you recall that the Israelite people wandered in the wilderness for a long time, and they wandered in the land of Moab here, which is east of the Dead Sea. And eventually they crossed over into the land of Canaan, and they were a loosely knit confederacy, so to speak, of tribes. And it was during that time, before Saul became the first great king of the nation, that the judges ruled. And if you want to know about that time, you look at the book of Judges, but I think it is captured most beautifully in one verse in the 17th chapter of Judges. In those days, there was no king in Israel, and every man did what was right in his own eyes. It was a time when the Israelite people began to engage in the compromise of their faith. They began to mesh something of their own historic faith, the faith of Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Joseph, and with the gods and the practices of the Canaanite people whose land they had occupied. This is called religious syncretism, and syncretism was really what was going on in that day. And so there was idolatry, morality, et cetera, et cetera. Every man did what was right in his own eyes. So that's when this particular story takes place. It says, in the days when the judges ruled, there was a famine in the land. The idea that there was a famine is important because that sort of drives the action. The action that follows takes place because there was a famine in Judah, and this family needed to find a place where they could get food. So there was a famine in the land, and a certain man of Bethlehem, that tells us that this was a family that was part of the community of the Israelites, covenant people. They lived in Bethlehem, which is located only a few miles outside of Jerusalem. And a certain man of Bethlehem in Judah went to sojourn in the country of Moab. Now, that's really not that far. By distance, it's only about 60 miles from Jerusalem over to the land of Moab. You can, on a clear day, you can almost see that far across the Dead Sea, but apparently they had heard that there was food maybe available in Moab, and so they become a migrant family moving from Judah to Moab to find food. And he and his wife and his 2 sons. And the name of the man was Elimelech, and the name of his wife was Naomi. And the names of his 2 sons were Mahlon and Chilion, and they were Ephrathites, they were from Ephrathah, from Bethlehem in Judah. And they went into the country of Moab and remained there. Well, when they got there, unfortunately, Elimelech died, and Naomi became a widow. The 2 sons, Mahlon and Chilion, married, Moabite women. One was named Orpah, and the other was named Ruth. And that's how we come to get Ruth in the story. But what's important is these were Israelite men marrying Moabite women. They were marrying foreigners, people who were outside of the covenant community of the people of Israel. Well, as way leads on the way, not only does Elimelech, Naomi's husband, die, but these two boys, Mahlon and Chilion, die. Interestingly, the names, Mahlon means sickly, and Chilion means weak. I'm not quite sure why you would name your children that, but the names proved to be prophetic, and they both died. And so now you have Naomi and Orpah and Ruth, all of whom have been widowed in the story. And of course, Naomi, as a Jewish woman, has that theological idea that if something bad happens to you, it's because of something you've done that was bad in your life, some sin, and it's connected to that. So she begins to have this understanding of God that her sorrows are really a punishment for something that she has done. And she says, verse 13, the hand of the Lord has gone forth from me. She feels abandoned by and bereft of God. Well, the famine in the land of Judah begins to be abated. And we read in the 6th verse that Naomi had heard in the country of Moab that the Lord had visited his people and given them food. So now she hears they got food back in Judah, and she says, I think we're going to move back to Judah. But she says to her daughters-in-law, you don't need to go with me back to Judah. You're Moabites, after all. And your chances of remarriage are a lot better here in Moab than they're going to be back in Judah. So she encourages them to stay. And Orpah, Mahlon's wife, says, okay, I'll stay. But then in the most famous line of the book of Ruth, we read what Ruth says. Entreat me not to leave you or to return from following you, for where you go, I will go. Where you lodge, I will lodge. Your people shall be my people, and your God, my God. How many of you heard that at a wedding? It is not a husband speaking to a wife. It's not a wife speaking to a husband. It is a woman speaking to her mother-in-law. But it is an important statement, because what she's saying when she says, your God will be my God, she'll say, I may be a Moabite, I may be a foreigner, but I'm going to adopt your faith. I'm going to become a part of what you're a part of as that covenant community with God. So Ruth makes this crucial decision that she's going to go with Naomi back to Judah. And that's what they do, which brings us then to the second scene. And the second scene is in Bethlehem. And they arrive back in Bethlehem, and there's this wonderful verse. So the two of them went on until they came to Bethlehem. And when they came to Bethlehem, the whole town was stirred because of them. The gossip chain in Bethlehem went wild because, Naomi, this was the Naomi that was an Israelite. She lived here, she had Elimelech, but she abandoned us and went over to Moab, and look what happened to her. Her husband died, her sons died, but before they died, they married Moabite women, and now she comes dragging this foreigner, her daughter-in-law, into Judah again. I mean, yak. That's what was going on there in Bethlehem. But Naomi and Ruth now are two widows in a country that had no civil institutions that would take care of their hardships. So here they are. Which brings us to, in the end of that verse, says, and they came to Bethlehem at the beginning of the barley harvest. Well, that's important because now something positive is happening again. There's food there. And the third, that leads us to the third scene, which is in the second chapter of Ruth. And that scene takes place in a field, which happens to belong to a man named Boaz. Boaz is a kinsman or relative of Naomi's husband, deceased husband, Elimelech. And Naomi, pardon me, doesn't scheme at this point, but Ruth decides she's going to take advantage of the practice of gleaning, and she's going to go and glean these fields to get some grain for their food. Gleaning was a regular practice that was for people who were poor. In the book of Leviticus, it says that they could harvest the center of their fields, but the edges of their fields they would leave for the poor to be gleaned. And so Ruth is going to take advantage of that. So she goes to this field to glean the field. And there, there's this wonderful line in verse 3. She set forth and went and gleaned in the field after the reapers. And she happened to come to the part of the field belonging to Boaz. How many times when you hear somebody talk about the work of God in their lives, they say that phrase, you know, I was just doing this, and it just so happened that this person came at the right time to do something for me. I cannot tell you how many times that happened in my ministry where I would go and visit someone and they would say, you know, you can't know how important it was for you to come. You just happened to be here at the right moment for me. And I think that is in the mystery of God, something that takes place with those who are God's people. We do something and we do it because it's the right time of day, or it's just because on our list. But if we do that for some other person, it may just be the way God is doing something important in their lives. And, you know, I could probably fill until 12:30 talking about illustrations of how that's happened in my life, and you could share that as well in your lives. But I think that's a lovely phrase that tells us God is at work in this story behind the scenes. We don't, it's not didactic and it's not preachy. It just says God and the mystery of God's work is a part of this whole process. So Boaz then, you know, takes care of her, Ruth, whether it's out of compassion or romance or just because she's a hard worker and he sees how hard she's working and gleaning, whatever it caused him. But he took notice of her and he provided her protection. Ruth returns home with barley, and Naomi asks Ruth about what has happened. You know, you bought this big thing of barley, and there's this line where she told her mother-in-law with whom she had worked and said, "The man's name with whom I worked today is Boaz." And Naomi says, Boaz is a relative. You know, can you believe that? You show up and you start going to glean somebody's field, and it's Boaz, who is a kinsman of my husband, Elimelech. So just happened to be that field. Again, you see, you know, God's providence working out in the nature of the story. So Naomi says to her, this man's a relative of ours, one of our nearest kin. And of course, that's important because this means that he might be able to then claim the right of kinship. And this looks like this situation is looking a little better. We come to our fourth scene, and that takes place at the threshing floor, the threshing of the barley or the wheat, the grain. And here is I think a little bit of a humorous element. Naomi before did not encourage Ruth to go out to glean the fields. She wasn't plotting. But now in chapter 3, in this fourth scene, Naomi has decided, I need to help God's purposes take place. I need to nudge this process along. She believes that God's hand is at work in the process, but she also believes that human planning and scheming can have a part in that process as well. So she believes in God's will, but she has a bias of what she wants to see happen. So she says to Ruth, go take a bath, put on your best dress, and go over to the threshing floor. And when Boaz gets all liquored up at night, and he falls asleep, you plant yourself at his feet. And when he wakes up, the first thing he's going to see is your lovely face. Well, that's not exactly how they say it. But I'm just kind of contemporizing this a little bit. But that's essentially what happens. And so, sure enough, Ruth goes to the threshing floor. Boaz gets liquored up. He falls asleep. He wakes up at midnight. And when he wakes up at midnight, whose lovely face does he see? The face of Ruth. So that's chapter 3 and threshing floor. And it's kind of a funny scene because Ruth wakes up and, Boaz wakes up and he's startled to see this woman lying at his feet. And he says, who in the... No, he doesn't exactly say it like that. Who are you? Well, it's Ruth. And so she tells it. And I'm the daughter-in-law of Naomi. And he said, wow. Naomi's a relative of mine. And so now we begin to see that things are working out. And Boaz says, okay, I realize that I'm a kinsman and I might be able to redeem the property of Naomi that belonged to Elimelech, and ultimately marry you, but I'm not the first one in line. There is a nearer kin than me. So a little fly in the ointment here. So we come to scene 5. And scene 5 is at the village gate of Bethlehem, of the community. And Boaz shows up at the gate and says he goes to the gate and sat down there, and behold, just so happened that the next of kin of whom Boaz had spoken came by. Just so happened this nearest kin shows up. Boaz said, turn aside, friend, sit down. And he turned aside and sat down. And then they got the elders together. And Boaz reminds him that he is the nearest of kin. And he has, not he, Boaz, the other man. And this other man has the right of first refusal for the property and for the hand of Ruth. And so he's selling this idea to this guy who's the nearest of kin. But then Boaz says, but remember, the day you buy the field from the hand of Naomi, you are also buying Ruth, the Moabitess. So he said, you're going to get the land, the property, but you're going to get a wife in the bargain. And then it says, the other guy says, take my right of redemption yourself, for I cannot redeem it. So So that clears the path. And Boaz, before the city officials, redeems the right to the property of Naomi, Elimelech. And then he takes Ruth to be his wife. And we come to the final scene in this drama. And this final scene is in the new home of Boaz and Ruth. They have had a child, and the child's name is Obed, O-B-E-D, and which means servant. And this child, there's the line, a son has been born to Naomi, and they named him Obed, and he was the father of Jesse, the father of David. So now we see the connection. And you recall, maybe it was last Sunday in worship, the lesson from the Hebrew Bible was from Isaiah chapter 11. There shall come forth a shoot from the stump of Jesse, and a branch shall grow out of its roots. And the Spirit of the Lord shall rest upon him, the Spirit of wisdom and understanding, the Spirit of counsel and might, the Spirit of knowledge and the fear of the Lord. And his delight shall be in the fear of the Lord. And it goes on from there. But this shoot that comes forth from the stump of Jesse is nothing less than David, who, of course, is part of the line of Jesus. And so now we have the whole story. Ruth becomes the great grandmother of David, and she becomes an essential part of the line of the Messiah. And it's just a wonderful story that describes how God is working all the time behind the scenes in the lives of ordinary people. And God is ultimately sovereign. God rules and sometimes overrules our mistakes. And so when God works behind those scenes, we try to work with that. Coincidence happens, but sometimes coincidence equals providence. Not always, but sometimes. And so I think here's an encouragement for us to remain faithful, because we have to believe that God is at work behind the scenes in our lives, even when we experience dead ends and wrong turns and misfortunes. God still is a part of the process. But I think the other little thing that is, to me, a fascinating part is that God's grace is not limited to one group of people who claim themselves to be the covenant people, not one nationality of people who claim to be the great people of the earth. Our religious outlook has to be pretty large instead of narrow, because here we have a woman who is a foreigner in the story, who belongs to the ancestry of David and is a key to the story of redemption. So I don't know whether I've gone too long or not, but I think this is a great story. And thank you for letting me kind of recount it today for you, in both its historic particularity and its eternal relevance, because it is relevant. Thank you all, John.
Well, thank you.